So I want to welcome members and guests to our first 2022 quarterly educational meeting. We have an exciting program for you today, and we appreciate you joining us. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, we are especially pleased that you are with us, and we hope you will find today's presentation to be informative. AKA is a nonprofit organization powered by volunteers devoted to connection, education, and support. Our programs and services are designed with the knowledge that adoption deeply impacts all the people involved, and that adoption is an ongoing, lifelong process, not a one-time event. Our program will have closed caption, CC, for accessibility. This box can be moved anywhere on your screen, and if anyone does not need closed captioning, feel free to slide it off your screen. AKA is unique in that we bring together in one group all members of the adoption constellation: adopted people, birth parents, adoptive parents, prospective adoptive parents, extended family of community members, and professionals. Typically, all of these parties have been separated from each other, but we believe that great benefit comes from the learning and sharing we do together. During our meetings, if opinions are expressed that make someone in the room uncomfortable, please try to listen respectfully, not only from your own perspective, but from the other person's perspective as well. One of the greatest parts about AKA is that we can all listen and hear each other's voice. Although many aspects of adoption are filled with joy, there are also parts of adoption that are difficult and painful. Those painful aspects are sometimes hard to honor, but our ability to acknowledge the side of adoption is part of what makes AKA unique, powerful, and brings richness and growth to our members. If this is your first AKA meeting, we are very excited you are here. Over the course of the year, we try to offer a wide range of topics in our general meetings and aim to offer programming applicable to all members of the adoption community, as well as to the adoption adjacent communities such as donor conception, foster care, and those with DNA discoveries. We are also proud to conduct an annual educational conference each November, which allows us to bring many topics and experts together on one weekend, led by keynotes of prominence in the adoption issues. We'll hear more about this event held in conjunction with National Adoption Awareness Month. Peer support groups are at the heart of AKA's mission. We have a number of peer support groups that meet each month for adoptees, first birth parents, adoptive and foster parents, and individuals with DNA discoveries. Our groups are free and happen via Zoom and are in the Austin area. Check our website calendar and dates and times. We also offer search assistance for those searching for relations disconnected through closed adoption. This service is free for AKA members and provided by AKA Search Angels volunteers. Call the office or email us for more information and assistance. Now I'm going to hand it over to Dirk. Thanks, Dirk.
Thanks, Karen. I just want to go over a couple of housekeeping items. Once the meeting started, please mute yourself by clicking the microphone at the bottom left of the screen, except for during the Q&A if you have a question. And then next, if you're multitasking, we ask that you please turn off your Zoom camera by clicking the camera icon next to the microphone at the bottom left, because we want to limit distractions as best we can for everyone. And please use the right hand feature to ask questions during the Q&A. And I've also got some general info on our AKA meetings and groups and events. AKA holds quarterly meetings 4 times per year over Zoom. We also offer several peer support groups that meet monthly over Zoom as well. We also have AKA Summer Book Club, which will start on May 26th. The first book is A Piece of Cake by Cupcake Brown. And also, please save the date for our big annual conference. This year's theme is Pebbles to Pearls, celebrating 30 years of connection, education, and support. And this event takes place on November 4th and 5th. And all of these events are over Zoom. And then finally, we'd love to have you become members of AKA. Membership applications are available on our website. And you can also join our online Facebook community as well. But our benefits include access to our lending library, AKA's newsletter with information about adoption relevant events, legislative updates, and more. Also search assistance, discounts at other AKA events, and CEUs for work licensees. And as an FYI, CEUs are offered for many of these events, including today's. And then as a final reminder, please turn in your CEU evaluation forms in order to receive certificate of credit. You can obtain these by mailing AKA at adoptionknowledge.org after the meeting. All of this information and more can be found on our website at www.adoptionknowledge.org. Now I'm going to hand it up to Marcy.
Thanks, guys. Okay, so Patricia Dorner, if you don't know her, she's a pioneer in open adoption and post-adoption services. Patricia Martinez Dorner has been a relentless proponent of adoption reform. Her adoption-focused practice includes education, support, and training to individuals and professionals. She's a frequent conference speaker and author of many adoption-related books. She's the adoptive mother of 2 adult daughters. She lives adoption personally and professionally. Patricia's insistence on the need to move away from closed, shame-based practices to a model emphasizing truth and transparency, and one that includes all voices in adoption, are what endears her to me personally. When I think of Patricia, I also think of her work highlighting the need for family reunification for children in foster care and minors in adoptive families. For me, this is definitely ahead of my time to hear her speak on that issue, as well as her allyship and activism in the fight for open adoption records access. Patricia was the 2018 recipient of AKA's Esteemed Adoption Vanguard Award for these very reasons. Join me in welcoming Patricia Martinez Dorner. Thank you, Patricia.
Thank you, Marcy. Okay, thank you, Technology Plus. I am so pleased to be with you this evening and for inviting me, of course. I have been part of AKA from the days when Catherine Shelley, Jeff Moore, and Jim Rockwell were talking about organizing and beginning this organization. And as I recall, the first time that I heard them talking about it was at a hotel where Janie Cravens was doing a conference, as I recall, unrelated to adoption. So it was a very exciting time to be able to be part of that. And so, oh goodness. So just want to let you know, I've been around for a really long time. Now I've got you all in front of me. Okay, now we're in business. I can see myself and you. Good. Okay, so today what I'm going to do is talk about my journey over time, my learning process, underlining the fact that when I got involved with adoption, I knew nothing. My first experience was with the sister of somebody that I had as a counselee, who came to me. She was not my counselee, but she came to me because she knew me and asked me to go with her to tell her mother because she was pregnant. So I did, because I loved those kids. She was probably 16 years old, and she was probably in middle school, 6, 7, maybe 8th grade. And so I went with her to tell her mother, and her mother immediately said that an adoption would occur. I had no experience with any of that. I had no power over anything they did, but they chose to go to Florence Crittenden in the Washington, DC area because I was living in Maryland. And so I went with her and her mother to Florence Crittenden. And when we were there, they explained what their process was, which included that when the baby was born, that she would spend a few weeks with the baby and then the child would be adopted. I had no judgment, I had no knowledge, but I was very impacted by the experience of being with her. And when I saw her briefly after the baby was born and adopted, all I needed to do was to ask her how she was. I had no idea. I know that when I heard the people at Florence Crittenden talking about her spending a few weeks with her child, that I was quite horrified. I had no idea of how important that was. So that's where I was, not much knowledge at all. When we approached Lutheran Social Service in 1977, pursuing adoption for ourselves, again, I had no idea. I did not even consider where my child would come from. I guess she was going to fly out of the sky, because it never occurred to me to think about her birth mother. We were very fortunate in that we approached an agency that even then was teaching what was known at the time about adoption. There were very, very few books that were out there yet. And so the entire process included education for prospective adoptive parents. And each seminar was focused on one role of adoption, and they would have speakers that would come and share the experience. So there were women who were considering adoption who would come and share the consideration process, and women who had already chosen adoption. At that time, I don't recall that there were any birth fathers or prospective men seeking or pursuing the possibility of adoption. And so each seminar focused on one of the roles. As time went by, the requirements grew to include reading for each seminar. And once the families had a child in the family, then there was continued education and support. If I had ended up at another agency, God only knows what my awareness process would have been or my involvement would have been. As I got involved with the agency, because I wasn't working outside of the home, I began to volunteer. And the majority of my volunteering was with women who were considering adoption. They were staying at a place near my home, and I would take them to the doctor. I would have them come to my house when my children were in my home. Some of them volunteered. Some I was there for when they chose adoption. I would be there when the adoption process was occurring. And this was gut-wrenching for me. In those days, there was very little reading material in the mid-70s. And so each time a new book would be produced, the agency director, who was an incredible leader, truly listening to what people were teaching us about adoption at the time, and was really encouraging us as each new book came out. So in those days, the early books were Adoption Triangle, Twice Born, Lost and Found. Those were the days of very early openness. And one of the reasons that the agency began the process of going towards openness was the reading and the voices that were being learned, but there was also a young woman who had chosen adoption for her child, and she clamored to know about the welfare of her child and the parents who were adopting her child. And doing some what I consider good social work, the agency director then said, yes, we're going to get you a letter from the adoptive parents. And she was able to send a letter as well. At that time, it was kind of a one-time expectation. But those were the early days of openness, if you will. And as the more that I learned and was involved with the auxiliary, I wasn't yet working for the agency or working in this field, but by volunteering and by reading, I was really getting a sense of the depth of the adoption experience. And I would say through our auxiliary, because we had an auxiliary, I would say, well, if the people that are speaking about their experience with adoption say they need to know who they look like, why aren't we getting pictures of the families of our children? And so gradually, it wasn't just my voice, there were other people who were doing the reading, who were learning, who were clamoring, and the agency director was considering these things, and gradually we were learning and moving along in the process. I want to underline, because this is really critical, when we were making changes in the practice of adoption, it truly was a response to what we were learning and observing. And each time that a step was taken to go further into what we know as open adoption, we had retreats. I want to mention that Janie Craven in those days was a baby social worker. She had just finished and was, and many of you know Janie, she's a wonderful professional, and Janie was involved in the process towards total open adoption. And we would have retreats. It was, let's meet and talk about what would be the impact of sharing a first name, and what would be the impact of meeting one another. We learned that there was an agency in Green Bay, Wisconsin that had already done meetings. And I can remember getting on the phone at the agency. We're about 8 of us getting on the phone, calling this social worker in Green Bay, Wisconsin. It was a Catholic agency there, talking and asking about what their experience was with people meeting one another. So every step that was taken was done attending to what could be positive for all the people that were involved, both the possible birth parents that would live with birth parenthood, the adoptive parents, and of course, the adopted persons. And I really want to underline that none of this was an effort to seduce birth parents. Unfortunately, what I observed as time passed is that there were agencies that would offer the vocabulary of open adoption in order to create a seduction to bring in people in crisis. And that is the tragedy of it all, because I can say I was a witness to the process that we were evolving with, that truly was an effort to be responsive and to provide the needed services in a responsive kind of way. So we went from the one-time letter to ongoing letters, to sharing of first names, to finally a meeting, and eventually ongoing meetings where we would consider it truly an open adoption, where people were identifying each other, would know who they were and how to find each other, acknowledging that we are family to one another. Now, I often talk about the fact that adoption creates blended families. And whether we know each other or not, we are family trees that are connected. And that is not to minimize the complexities of adoption. All families are complex. Blended families are complex. And adoption brings together people often from different worlds and experiences, but that connection is that child that brings us together. And so whether we know each other, whether we do great with each other or not, we are family to each other. And for me, I think that's a critical expression of acknowledging that we have features that are important regarding family. Because I had been an active volunteer and I was a mental health professional, a program was developed at the agency, which was funded by United Way. And the person that was going to conduct that program decided to go to law school. That was Phyllis Speedlin, the co-author of Dear Birth Mother. And so they asked me to take on this program, which was intended to be a program to give support to adoptive families in the community, and also to do teaching in the community. And so I thought that was great. I was quite involved already as a volunteer. I already was having a sense of the issues in adoption, and it was an exciting opportunity. What I didn't realize was that I would very quickly get immersed in the search process, because as we publicized the fact that this program existed, I started getting callers who were, if you do a statistical representation, most of them were adopted persons and a smaller number were birth parents. I didn't get a lot of adoptive parents yet at that time. So that it was quite a dramatic plunging in to an area where I didn't know what I was doing, but we already had the beginning awareness of the impact on all parties over the years, that in fact, it was a lifelong process of great complexity. And what I discovered and felt that was important for all the people that we were working with was the fact that there is a huge importance in understanding our own issues in relation to our own role, but also the issues for the other roles. If one is an adopted person, to really be in touch with how that manifests for oneself, but also to have an understanding of the impact of adoption on someone that chooses adoption as a birth parent or an adoptive parent or extended family for that matter. So one of the things that I did, because as I became more desirous of having information for my children, I often tell people that when I read Betty Jean Lifton's books, Twice Born and Lost and Found, that I was so dramatically impacted. I cried for weeks. I didn't want my child to experience that. And at that time, her birth mother was very resistant to participating. She was very much shamed within her family. So what I did instead, because I had a free hand to do whatever I wanted, which was wonderful, the agency director did trust me, so that helped. I started contacting birth parents who had worked with the agency previously to see how they were doing. I was reading about all of these issues that were so complex and so challenging, but now I wanted to touch base and really find out how they were doing. And so evolved, again, in an unexpected kind of way, my involvement with opening adoptions. Because once I contacted birth parents who would share how they were doing and what they were wondering, I would contact the adoptive parents of those children and share whatever I had learned. Well, pretty soon I had adoptive parents that would contact me and ask me to contact the birth parents of their children. And so I evolved into the search process, doing education in the community, and also the opening of adoptions. What we found, of course, is that the program I was with, which was mostly focused on post-adoption, it reinforced what we were doing in the arena of the development of open adoption. And so that whole development of open adoption was an effort to empower the parties that were considering adoption. And I want to also underline that very often we had people that considered adoption because we were doing options counseling. There were many that chose not to pursue adoption, and there was no pressure for that. And that's an important underlining statement, because there are agencies that would spend a lot of money supporting people who were considering adoption, but then expected them to pursue that decision. And so I am witness to the fact that pressure was not applied to pursue adoption. Instead, it was empowering the people we were working with to be able to make some decisions about how to pursue their particular journey. And by then, part of the process included the prospective people considering adoption for their babies or their children to be able to select the families that resonated for them and to be able to meet them. And even as time went by, where prospective adoptive parents might be included in the birthing process. Now, I have to tell you, because I was involved in a multitude of ways, and I knew a lot of the people that were experiencing the counseling and the preparation and so on, that I had been, for example, with a young woman who delivered her baby, and she's to me about she was thinking that she'd like to raise her child. And for me, it was critically important to say to her, this is your child. The fact that you have met these nice people and they have been with you does not in any way put forth an obligation for you to turn your child over to anybody. And this is all part of all this emotional interfacing that happened with these various people coming together at critical and vulnerable times. And when we worked with disappointed prospective adoptive parents, part of our training was to prepare them for the possibility that no decision occurs before the birth of the child and until after the birth of the child, when that prospective parent, with that parent that's going to be raising or not raising that child, has a chance to once again reevaluate, receive proper counseling, and examine the ramifications of a possible decision. Now, as we were doing this work, needless to say, we were considered the lunatics. Not only were we doing open adoption, but we were also doing searching. Can you imagine? So there were a lot of obstacles. The non-believers, if you will, were convinced that children would get confused if they had birth family in their lives. They were convinced that birth parents would be intrusive. They were convinced that this would be co-parenting. Well, needless to say, none of that correct. And yet, as time passed, the benefits and challenges were observed, leading to more and more open adoption nationally. Now, I want to say that though we use the vocabulary of open adoption, that there are many expressions related to that. There are many different facilitators that treat it very differently. They may call it open adoption while people are making decisions, but then once an adoption occurs, they lose contact with one another. Terrible. That's not open adoption. The idea is that one would have an ongoing relationship, knowing one another, building relationship over time. Now, we have lots of expressions of it. I think that one of the very good expressions of it is seen right there in San Antonio with my good friend Elizabeth, with Abrazo. Elizabeth has, I've done a lot of work with Elizabeth, and through the years, she's used my services to counsel with people considering adoption. And she has allowed me to really explore all the options. And there have been some people who have chosen adoption, some who have not, and there's never been any pressure. And I think that's really valuable. Additionally, I have been used to mediate contact over the years and help people deal with whatever arises. The main thing is that family is complicated, and being able to provide services is so important. There are other programs around the country. Obviously, I can't name every single person that has come into my life, but it's important to know that there are people who are doing good ethical work and others who are doing slapdash work. At the time that I was asked to take on the Adoption Awareness Center in 1981, that's when I took that program on, we still did not have a lot of awareness of the national network that existed. We had read the books, we were aware of some of the things that were out there and some of the people, but we were not yet totally aware of all the activities that were going on, the activism. And so I was aware of a program in Minnesota that was a early post-adoption program, but their idea of post-adoption was to provide counseling. It didn't involve any searching or reconnection process. And they had kind of a satellite program at another agency in Houston, the Belgian, where the lady there had been trained by Marietta Spencer, also from Minnesota. Again, it was not about searching. It was very focused on counseling, which to me kind of sounded like maladaptive issues, traumatic issues. Let's do something proactive. At that time, I still didn't know Joyce Pavo. I didn't know Jim Gritter. We didn't know that Jim Gritter in Traverse City was doing much of what we were doing, kind of parallel activity, and that there were others. Along with the work that I was doing, I began to do court access, because while a lot of people were coming to me because of the agency I was involved with, the program was a United Way program. So I was doing a lot of presentations in the community and media, and people would become aware of what I was doing. So before long, I was doing work at the court, accessing records in order to be able to help people search through the courts. At that time, in the early 80s, people were able to access their own records frequently in San Antonio. And I never got in the way of that. I never felt that people had a need to have me involved. If they wanted me involved, I'd be glad to be involved, but I never advocated for intermediaries. Now, because I didn't know what I was doing, my mentors were people from within the search movement. Some of you may have known Pat Palmer with Searchline. She was a birth mother who had gone through adoption with her daughter through Methodist Mission Home. And years later, I was involved in helping her reconnect with her daughter, which was a real honor because I loved Pat. She was just wonderful and very generous in helping me learn how to do what I was now doing as a novice. She had this search group helping people all over the place, just incredibly from her heart. And then there was Peggy Dorn. I don't know if any of you that are on this group today knew Peggy. She's another wonderful human being. She was adopted herself, and through her lifetime had not discovered her original family. DNA was really not in place yet. And she started a group called Orphan Voyage, which was the group that Jean Payton started many years before. And Peggy also helped countless people and was incredible. And then, of course, our dear Pam Hasagawa. They were my three main mentors. Pam was with Alma and very active legislatively, trying to get records opened up and doing advocacy. And they really guided me. And in my early days, I really didn't know that the original birth certificate was sealed or its importance. But by the time that I was immersed, I, of course, understood. And when we adopted our second daughter, and we're going through the court process in 1981, Peggy Dorn guided me on how to get her original birth certificate because I knew her birth mother's name, even though she was not in contact with us to the degree that we wanted at that time. So these people were wonderful. They were very self-effacing. They gave from their heart. They helped people. They tried to teach. And many of them, Pat Palmer ended up doing intermediary work for the court in Tarrant County. She helped countless people all over the country. She was interconnected with all the search groups around the country, and as was Peggy. And of course, Pam, once the years passed, she was not just with Alma, but it started interfacing with the American Adoption Congress as well. So these are people that made incredible contributions to the world of adoption, helping and knowing how to search and really offering their time. One of the things that I like to mention is that the process of open adoption, because people know each other, makes it possible for families to obtain the original birth certificate before the records are sealed. It seems kind of nonsensical that records would get sealed at all, especially when everybody knows everybody. But unfortunately, that continues. So in my work, I always have advocated that before court activity happens, that people should get those original birth certificates. And that includes birth parents and adoptive parents, because of course, the adoptive parents would be getting it for their children. Now, my court involvement was such that I had access to files of the agency that I represented, but for anybody else that came to me, I had to be able to access the court records wherever I could. And I didn't limit myself to San Antonio. I worked with people nationally, and when it was possible, I would get court orders from San Antonio and send them to other areas. And if those areas were willing to accept them, then I cheered and very happily and got the records and was able to help the people that were seeking my assistance. There were two people that primarily helped me become credible, if you will, and trustworthy at the court. And one was Patricia, the attorney that was involved with as the attorney for the agency and for some other agencies as well. And the other was Phyllis Speedland, the person I told you did not take on the program I went into because she became a lawyer and then a judge. And so they would line up visits with judges in Bexar County and sometimes would link me in with judges other places in order for me to gain access to the court records. So they fund the lunch for me so that I could meet these judges and teach them why it was important. And again, always promoting it. I never wanted to be the only person to get these records. Unfortunately, as time went by, there were some situations that arose where an intermediary system was enacted in Bexar County because there had been some problems with people getting their own records. I would never push for intermediaries, but that was what they did. Now, sometimes, I would say 99.9% of the time, if my court order was signed, I could proceed with helping people do their searches. One time, however, I had an agency in San Antonio called Children's Service Bureau that would not accept the court order. So we contested it with the judge and he said they needed to have a hearing. So Jim Rockwell from AKA, our dear Jim Rockwell, went with me and the adopted woman who was in her 60s, and we met with the social worker, the director, and their attorneys. And because Jim was such an incredible voice in all of this, some of you may have known Jim. He was this short, wonderful, warm, loving man who had been adopted as a small child, as a baby, and he was an incredible spokesperson for the journey. And as a result of that exchange, we were able to get the records obtained, and they never gave me a hard time again. So that was really good. It helps to bring the voices of those involved together. Now, these early days were days before databases. I worked with public records and I called it the long division way, because eventually we were doing databases that cut through it rather rapidly. But in the early days, we were doing things the long division way. And I trained the Arizona Supreme Court intermediaries for 11 years. Again, I was not an advocate for intermediaries, but if that was an avenue to get records opened, then I was glad to be able to do the trainings. I also trained agencies, because as our learning grew, more agencies became more open to providing some post-adoption services. Catholic Charities asked me to write a manual on how to search, and I did a lot of trainings for them. Half of the manual was a how to search manual, and the other half was about maintaining contact for individuals who had been separated by foster care and bringing people back together, which was very exciting, because in those days, they were still the early days of consciousness about the importance of contact and reconnection for people from foster care. One of the things that always concerned me is that there were some organizations, some agencies that would provide post-adoption services to adoptive parents and to adopted persons, but they wouldn't provide anything to birth parents. And that was a terrible, terrible thing. And I called for and advocated for services to all. Very important that we lend a voice, because I never knew what the corresponding party's reaction would be to contact, to approaching. But I felt that just as adoptive parents were able to obtain information about their children, or the adopted person could inquire, that birth parents were just as entitled to receive ongoing information about their children and to receive the services that they were entitled to as well. It was a therapeutic approach to adoption rather than eternal punishment. So as time went by, I started learning more and more about the needed preparation for all the stages of adoption, including search and contact. Some of the early materials that were very helpful in terms of raising the issues pertaining to adoption were written by Pat Palmer and Nancy Sitterly. Pat Palmer was in California, and she started a search training kind of program to really make people able to search. And her focus, of course, was mostly people from within the experience. She and Nancy Sitterly was an adopted person, and she lived in Massachusetts, no, Pennsylvania. I'm trying to remember. Anyway, they wrote one of the early books that I used extensively in my work, Search, Aftermath, and Adjustments. It was a wonderful little booklet with wonderful content, well before many other materials. As we went along with my involvement, I got more and more awareness of the national efforts to make records accessible, as well as efforts to keep it secretive and closed. I learned about the Tri-Adoption Library, which was begun by somebody by the name of Mary Jo Rilera. Mary Jo was both an adopted person and a birth parent, and she created the Tri-Adoption Library with all kinds of resources, including the constant updating of the search and support groups. There are more than 200 search and support groups around the country. And it was an incredible time of interfacing and networking. And initially, I wasn't part of that. I was just aware of it. But as people began to trust me, I began to interface more. And it was really quite amazing. There was also the International Soundex Reunion Registry that was created by Emma Velarde in Nevada. It was a wonderful registry at the time because it was free. Everybody could join in. It was international in nature, and they worked their butts off to get information put in there and to help people connect. What's really, I think, very impacting is that our involvement with the activists and their advocacy really influenced the development of true open adoption. By 1981, the agency, which still at that time was under the leadership of Kathleen Silber, the adoptions that were happening were open adoption with the expectation of ongoing relationships across families. So it was really important. Now, in late 1981, one of our colleagues went to an early American Adoption Congress conference in Kansas. And she came back totally fired up with all the knowledge she had learned and what she had witnessed, and said that she had volunteered us to do the 1982 conference. And so, thinking that we were going to be social butterflies and that we'd just find a place to do the conference, we quickly learned that that wasn't the case. They had no money to give us. We had to make all the arrangements. Plus, because we were an agency, there were a lot of people in the activist movement that were not happy that an agency was involved. However, we put on a magnificent conference with incredible representation from all the activists around the country. It was the most amazing experience. Jean Payton, who was considered the grandmother of adoption, she was a social worker, adopted person. She had written the book, The Adopted Break Silence, in 1953. She was the one who started Orphan Voyage. She was by now, I guess, in her 80s, and she was walking around the Hyatt Hotel in San Antonio in chains in order to demonstrate the metaphor for being an adopted person. Lee Campbell was there, the founder of Cub. Sandy Musser, the person who wrote I Would Have Searched Forever. She's on my face. These people on my Facebook. So if any of you on my Facebook, you can link in with them as well. Emma Velarde has now died, but she was there. Annette Barron from the Adoption Triangle and Lethal Secrets was there. There were so many of these activists that were all over the hotel, not just in the workshops, but in the hallways. The Hyatt Hotel people told us that they had never witnessed a conference of such incredible intensity, emotional demonstrations very publicly. But in the process, the content was such, because we were covering content that they also were able to suggest, obviously, by their presenters. It wasn't just us creating a program, that many, many agencies, because we were able to bring in professionals as well, actually modified their programs as a result of this conference. So the advocacy for change was happening. Actually, we made them a lot of money. I was a really good treasurer. We made them a lot of money, turned it all over to them. We never even charged for our time. We had an incredible experience. It was really very wonderful. Okay, then in 1983, so that moves on with the contact that we had with them. We were getting to know them. They became more resources for us as well. And in 1983, Kathleen Silber, the director of the agency, and Phyllis Speedlin wrote the book, Dear Birth Mother, which explored mythology and adoption. It became a classic, and it really honored the birth parent experience and raised a lot of attention. Throughout the country, birth parents had and continue to have incredibly painful experience. They didn't have counseling, and so children were born and adopted frequently without being able to spend time with each other. And it was sometimes they didn't even know the sex of their child. It was just criminal. It was just incredible. So we did a tremendous amount of education and advocacy to try to teach about the mythology of adoption, which included things like, if an adopted person had the need to know more about original family, it had nothing to do with the adoptive parents. Search was not an issue of turning one's back or in any way giving negative information about adoptive parenting. The belief that birth parents were always hiding in the bushes, that they were going to come to intrude. We really worked on that birth parents were not intrusive, that they really wanted what was best for their children. And of course, the other one that often arose related to birth parents forget. And we made sure that we conveyed the fact that they never do. As a matter of fact, one of my earliest searches that I often share was a young man. He was about 28 years old. He wrote me a letter and said that he wanted help in solving the greatest mystery of his life. He wanted help to do a search. It was very impacting for me to hear those words. And so I did a search and found his birth mother. And the first thing out of her mouth was, "Is he okay?" And they told me I would forget, but I never did. Just in that exchange with those two people, I had the encapsulation of some core issues that were very profound in adoption. In 1983, we decided to do a national adoption conference. We had done the 82 for the AAC and felt like it had gone well. We had some experience now. So we did the Open Adoption Conference National. And because I loved Pam and had had a lot of contact with Pam Hasegawa, I invited her to come to the conference. And we wanted to keep expanding people's understanding of why open adoption was so important. One of the things that we did was, because Pam was still representing and working with Alma, we decided to do an evening support group, and Alma style, where people share their stories. So we had a group of people there sharing their stories. And there was a young woman there who was an attorney. She had been invited by Patricia Wieste, the attorney who was the attorney for the agency. She said, "We're having a conference on adoption and you're adopted. If you want to come along." So she did. And so she came to the support group. And as people are sharing all their stories, all of a sudden, this lawyer shared her story. Pam said, "I know your sister." Pam lives in New Jersey, you understand, and this attorney lives in San Antonio, you understand. Well, it turns out that Pam did know her sister, that from the story this young woman was sharing, that they actually were sisters. So we all went to my house afterwards and made the calls. It was very exciting. So this is what I call amazing grace. This work for me, I used to say amazing a lot, but as time went by, I found that so many aspects of the journey had a tremendous amount of amazing grace that people might say is coincidence, but it was just over and over these kinds of experiences that many people living adoption have shared. Now, it wasn't all smooth and easy rolling. As we kept advocating for change, as the people all around the country were advocating for change, there was also the opposition, if you will. The National Committee for Adoption was created in 1980. A lot of the funding was begun by Edna Gladney in Dallas, and then many, many agencies nationally joined in. And they hired a lobbyist by the name of Bill Pierce, who went around the country talking about the terrible evils of adoption if it became open adoption, and of course of searching, that people would intrude on the promises that were given to birth parents for secrecy forever, and that there would be more abortions, and all of it was done in an effort to block these efforts. He was involved hugely in pushing terrible registries where in effect people wouldn't even know about each other, and it would be really difficult for these registries to work. And so it was a very big challenge that we kept battling, if you will. When the registry went into being in Texas in 1983, there was a clause in there making it illegal for agency people to use agency files in order to search. Thankfully, Patricia Wieste, the attorney I previously mentioned, got involved in the legislative process, and it was worked out that we would be able to continue searching by keeping files, one for the searching registry, for the registry, and one for searching. So we were able to continue. Otherwise, we would have been impeded at the agency level. The good thing about the law at that time as well was that it also enacted the requirement that agencies in Texas had to share de-identified information for within the file to adoptive parents and to adult adoptees. And so that began the process of being able to get more information. So every year we looked for more resources to keep guiding what we were doing. More books were coming out. The Other Mother by Carol Schaefer, 20 Things Adopted Kids Wish Their Adoptive Parents Knew. Courageous Blessing by Carol Demuth, who was at Buckner in Dallas, a wonderful, wonderful professional and adopted woman. The Primal Wound by Nancy Verrier. All these materials were incredibly, incredibly powerful in making change happen and raising awareness. As we evolved in the learning, as I mentioned earlier, I got more and more involved with foster care concerns because I saw that we were doing open adoption for infants. Why weren't we doing it for children who already had experience at a conscious, very conscious growing level? They were already grown children, 3 years old, 4 years old, 5 years old, whatever it was, they had experienced family already. So I got very, very involved in trainings and advocacy to maintain contact before adoptions happened, when the children were in foster care, but also to reestablish contact when it had been interrupted. Some of the evolution in all of this experience was also the consciousness of the role of DNA, because as we were experiencing adoption and doing the searching, we were seeing the effects of the genes and the dramatic impact of how they manifested for people who've been separated all their lives. And Thomas Bouchard was invited to a conference in Dallas where he spoke about his work pertaining to separated twins. And I think that the world of adoption taught him a whole lot about how these similarities that are genetic in nature were manifesting. So many similarities that went well beyond physical attributes. I also want to share an anecdote. I had a client, his name was Claude. We became very good friends. I found his birth mother and discovered that she had Indian heritage. And for him, that was very mammoth because he had grown up in a Texas family in Alice, Texas, where they hunted, but he always wanted to hunt with a bow and arrow. And that was really very dramatic for him. Then we learned that he had a sister that had also been adopted, that she was older than he was, and that the mother had not been able to provide for her, as she was not only separating herself from Claude, but she also had this child that she was not able to raise. And so I began my quest to find her. And when I got the court records, because she had not been adopted through the agency where I was, we discovered that she had been adopted by a Lutheran family, however. So I called the lady at Lutheran that had all the records and asked her if she happened to know this lady who was Lutheran. It turns out that she was a cousin to that sister who was adopted. Okay, get it? Through adoption. She told me where this girl was and told me that this girl had been adopted by a family where the adoptive father died and the adoptive mother moved to Alice, Texas, because that's where her family was from. And Claude then realized that this was a little girl that in Alice, Texas, they knew this little girl that sat on the sidewalk crying, wanting her mother. That was his sister. Incredible. So these are the amazing grace stories of, you don't believe it unless you really believe and trust your source. So here we are. I'm just touching on, obviously in 45 minutes, we can't cover the whole world of the experience and the activism and the efforts made to bring about change. But I want to mention The Secret of the Unborn Child, written by Verney in 1981. It had to do with the impact of the child within the body of the mother and the impact on that child with her experience, if she had stress, if she had sadness, if she had any number of emotional experiences that would impact that unborn child. And certainly in the world of adoption and counseling women who are considering adoption, very often what they would do is shut down their acknowledgement of that child. And because it was the only way they thought they could cope, by separating emotionally. And I actually had a client that told me that she knew her birth mother had done that. Anyway, the upshot of that is that as I learned about Thomas Verney's work, I got very involved in doing trainings, even though I wasn't all that knowledgeable. to really help people acknowledge the babies in their bodies, because nobody ever knew whether it was going to be an adoption or not, but the impact would be life altering for that child within. And so I was advocating sounds from the mother, recording from the, passing on t-shirts and towels and whatever, and educating adoptive parents to the importance of all of that, as well as the transitioning. I have to tell you that in 1990, I attended a conference in Chicago of the AAC and talked with some professionals about what I was learning. And most of the ones I talked with didn't believe that there was any impact. It was that concept of tabula rasa, that there is nothing there for the unborn child. And I called neonatologists, I called all kinds of places trying to get confirmation for what resonated for me. And finally, it was a nurse that I knew who worked in the baby ICU, the ICU. And when I said to her, what are your thoughts about this? The impact on a child, the emotional tenor of the mother, all the issues that are faced by somebody in crisis and during pregnancy. And she said that when babies are in the ICU and the mothers come in, that their vitals go up. And when the mothers leave, that's when they die. So I felt very confirmed with Thomas Verney, and eventually he and another professional, Chamberlain, started the Pre and Perinatal International Association, focused on pre and perinatal. It was not focused on adoption, but totally important material of our consciousness for what we need to do in the world of adoption, whether somebody pursues adoption or not. We've got to help these expectant parents to really attend to the mental health, the experience of that unborn baby. I want to give credit for the 2005 occurrence where now it was possible to obtain original birth certificate in Texas if people knew the names of their birth parents. Oh, there's my alarm. It's telling me to stop. Okay, I do want to say this. Text Care, Martha Fralia and Nancy Schaefer's were hugely involved in getting that accomplished. So now for those of you that know the names of your birth parents, you're able to obtain the original birth certificates, not certified, but I don't even get them certified anymore through the courts. So the fact is that they deserve a tremendous amount of credit for that. We are having more progress. We're seeing more open adoption. We are seeing more understanding of complex issues. We are seeing more states that do have access to the original birth certificate. DNA has broken through the secrecy, which has made it possible for me to partially retire. I am thrilled that people can penetrate the barriers, the secrecy, and why it is that any legislator would think that keeping records closed makes sense. I don't get it. Right now, Louisiana is having committee meetings. They're going to be voting on Monday. So if any of you wish to support the Louisiana people, get on the list, call the House members. I've been calling to put in my 2-word bits, even though I'm not in Louisiana. I say I'm a therapist that works with people around the country, and I advocate it. It's really very, very important. We have to keep advocating. The reality is that adoption continues in the world. And if it's going to happen, it has to happen in the most ethical manner with the greatest support. It is a hugely complicated life journey. I live it every day with my own children and with the people in my life. And we strive, we've got to hang together to bring change about that is therapeutic, because the more healed our world is, the better it will be. So I'm open to your questions.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Patricia.